24-hour tweeting and 24-hour coverage of cable news. I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about sports. And a new book shows how covering sports has evolved over the past few decades. It's called Press Box Revolution. And I sat down with its author, veteran sports reporter Rich Coutinho. I'd be disingenuous to pretend that I don't know my guest. We work together. Congratulations on the book and on 30 years in the business. And my question, I guess, first is, 30 years ago to today, and it's a little bit of a loaded question, is sports reporting better, worse, and can it ever be the same given the advent of all the new technology and how we consume it?
It's different. I think there's good to it and I think there's bad to it, but I think basically the game is not the biggest thing anymore. It's what happens before the game, what happens off the field. Richard, who likes whom? Who doesn't like whom? I think social media's had a big impact on that. But I do think that we get more into the heart and soul of players than we ever did before. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a not so good thing. But I do believe, I firmly believe that the fans get more of what's going on beyond the game than they ever did before. And I think that's only going to intensify with time.
Well, let's talk about maybe some of the reasons why and also some of the consequences. One of the things you talk about in the book is 30 years ago, you wouldn't have seen both some of the credentialed media that are in there now because it didn't exist back then, but also you pretty much just saw a bunch of guys. You write in your book about when women came to the locker room, how they were embraced or weren't in the beginning, and how it's changed as a dynamic. It's
changed a lot, and I think the women in the locker room brought a diversity. And I'm a big believer, and you and I have had a lot of talks about this, that diversity is good in life. And sports is part of life.
How ugly was it in the beginning for the women?
Very ugly. In fact, the first day I was a Met reporter back in 1984, I heard two veteran writers, columnists, writing about how they were going to keep the women out of the locker room. And then later that year, there was an incident in the NLCS at Wrigley Field in Chicago where Claire Smith got thrown out of a locker room. And Steve Garvey, of course, was nice enough to go out and do the interview with her in the hallway. But then the following day, Major League Baseball made specific rules on how women had to have the access that men have. And I think the whole domestic abuse issue in sports has come to full front because women are in the locker room. I think it's a good thing. But I think there were a lot of guys in the beginning, and I called it the white male media group, that didn't like it and really fought against it and in a bad way.
I remember when WFAN launched, and it has changed the dynamic of sports, and obviously 1,000 of other sports talk radio and formats across this country now, but for the better or worse, in that you have to find stuff to argue about and debate because you got 24 hours to basically fill. But in many ways, does that also creep into the locker room as well? What they're saying, who's a bum, who's not, who ought to be traded, who ought to be fired. Talk about that and how it's changed the jobs of the reporters also when they walk into the locker room after hearing what the guys, Mike and the Mad Dog, were saying just before first pitch.
There wasn't a day when Mike and the Mad Dog were on the fan that their name did not come up in a locker room that I was in. And I think in a lot of ways, it made the players a little more resistant to giving off-the-record comments because I think they quickly realized that there was no such thing as off-the-record anymore. Everything was on the record. And I think Mike and the Mad Dog did a lot of good for the industry because they took a lot of the stereotypes and ripped them apart. You don't have to have a great voice to be on a talk show, as we know from Mike and Chris by listening to them. But we also know that they brought subjectivity into sports, where we always heard the columnists needed to be objective. And sports fans needed to be entertained all day. So it brought that out. But it also brought it out that the pre- and post-game show now became as important as the game. You not only had to get the players talking before the game, now managers talk before the game to the media and after the game.
You write in the book about the '86 Mets, and for anybody that lived through that, it's hard to believe, but the Mets owned the city for a window of time with a cast of characters and all the rest. There was the debauchery, there was drug abuse, there was all the things that we now know much more of. But I'm curious, in today's day and age, could the stuff that the Mets did in the '86 team have been could that team have even possibly have had the success today given the prevalence of social media, 24-hour cameras, everybody with a phone that also doubles as a recorder as well as a camera? Put it in context of that team in 2017.
It's a hard question to answer, but I would probably have to say no. There are so many things that we did when covering the Mets in those days, and being an old bartender too, I had a lot of input in knowing where they hung out. But there was almost that line you didn't cross, the personal life versus the on-the-field life. I will say,
you never would have thought, if you saw a guy that was wrecked in spring training, or guys doing stuff with pharmaceuticals, let's say, on the plane ride coming back from a road trip, it never would have crossed your mind for a second to report any of that. But now somebody is looking to get some news, and even if they're covering the team, they might even anonymously report that story, let alone put their name to it.
I think it's very true, Richard. And I think part of it, too, is that a lot of people in our sports industry, and I write about this in the book, you know, when we wanted to be sports reporters, it was in our soul as a 6 or 7-year-old kid. I think a lot of 20-somethings woke up one day and say, this might be a cool thing to do. So the objectivity and loving the game in that 3-hour baseball game that you're covering is gone, and it's all about the other stuff.
Final question. Go back 30 years ago and go back today. When you go into the locker room and you look at the other beat reporters, and we've talked about in this conversation that they come from whole different places you never would have imagined would have even existed 30 years ago, but they're there now. Do you worry that the fan isn't being served as well as they used to? You said it's different, but are you confident in the future that not just we'll get the box score, but we'll get also what happened more than just who's seeing who at what club at 4 in the morning?
I think they don't know the game as well as reporters did 25, 30 years ago. And I think sabermetrics is a big part of that. The statistical analysis, particularly in baseball, is a crutch. You can't read an article without hearing the words WAR, BABIP, WHIP. I don't know if that's interesting enough for fans today, but that analysis is gone.
Well, it's clear you still love the game, like myself here. And if you do, and you want to know what happens in the locker rooms and also when you're with the team and what it's like to be a beat reporter, the past, the present, and the future, definitely go check out Press Box Revolution. Rich Coutinho. Rich, thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Rich. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely.